Welcome to this podcast. I am today's host, Vinay Panda. In today's episode, we shall discuss preprints and the importance of preprints in scientific information dissemination. For the viewers that may not know, preprints are complete scientific articles deposited in servers free of cost. Preprints speed up the sharing of new findings, make scientific information freely and widely accessible, establish priority of scientific work, and boost article visibility and citation. Despite these advantages, the adoption of preprints, especially in faculty hiring and promotion across geographies and especially outside of the United States and some European countries, has been slow. To discuss the role of preprints, we have three special guests today. Mike Eisen, a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator and a professor of genetics, genomics, evolution, and development at the University of California at Berkeley. Rahul Siddharthan, a computational biologist from the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, India, and Katie Corker, executive director of ASA Bio. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to having a great discussion with you all.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Mike, let me start with you. As I mentioned in the introduction, and all of us know, preprints have many advantages. And it is no-brainer that all practicing scientists should adopt preprints to disseminate the results of their scientific experiments. We know that the majority of preprints, 75% as per one report, get published in peer-reviewed journals, and most preprints hold their value during peer review. Still, one of the most significant criticisms of preprint is that they are not peer-reviewed. How important is peer review in scientific literature and publications? And preprints not being peer-reviewed, is it something that we should be worried about, or should it bother us?
Well, that's an hour-long question. I think to start, let's say there's definitely value to everybody involved in the in the practice of having, when people read a paper and they think about it and they have something to say about the, quality of the science, the rigor of the analyses, and so forth, and they share that information with authors, readers, and so forth. It's undeniably valuable, undeniably part of science. So I think the question of how important is peer review as a concept is an easy one. It's critical, right? Science doesn't exist if we don't read each other's papers and think about what each other have done and offer some feedback. But the question that's really being asked here is peer review as a concept and as an activity worth doing. Is peer review before papers are published an essential part of doing science? And I think for me, the answer is unequivocally no. I think we evolved a system in which peer review happens before we publish papers in any kind of meaningful sense, really as a response to the limitations of technology that existed when we started operating in science. Right? It was not possible in the 17th century to share preprints online. And so, we evolved a system that dealt with the fact that we had to mail papers around to our colleagues, and, you had expenses and time and things like that involved in the dissemination process. But the idea that you can't do science if you're reading things that your colleagues haven't told you it's okay to read is just ludicrous, right? Like, we've all survived as scientists for a long time reading papers that we were peer reviewing. Most of the science that we consume outside of literature isn't peer reviewed. People are constantly giving talks and saying, this is new data from my lab. These are new ideas. These haven't been published. These haven't even been preprinted yet. So we do fine, absorbing scientific knowledge in all sorts of ways. And we make judgments about what is and isn't valid on our own as scientists. I would say, in fact, we're probably better off if we interact with the literature in that way as skeptical consumers. And when we have something that's worth sharing that we think our colleagues will benefit from thoughts we have about a paper as we read it, the preprint system that we have today makes it very easy to share that information with the world. So I think the idea that preprints stand in opposition to peer review it's a flawed concept from the get-go. We have lots of ways of peer reviewing preprints. We have lots of ways of sharing what we think about preprints. It's just we live in a new world where we can share information quickly and easily without cost. And so that's the way science should operate in an ideal universe. And we can harvest all the benefits of people reading and commenting and sharing their thoughts on preprints even better in a world where we're not tied to a system of peer-reviewed journals. So I think we shouldn't start with this idea that preprints stand in opposition to peer review. Preprints, in fact, I would argue, make it possible for us to have a much more robust and effective system of peer review than we have today.
Thank you for saying that. I wanted to throw the most critical aspect that people often cite, and wrongly so. And as you said, obviously, the whole concept of talking about peer review in preprint is misplaced. Now, let me extend that further and ask you the second question that we know, and as you mentioned rightly, that the process of peer review or getting what peers think about critically about your work is absolutely important. I don't think anyone denies that. It's all the question about how do we review the scientific literature today? There is peer review before an article is published, and there is obviously post-publication peer review. Now, do you think a post-publication peer review with a system which is yet to be developed, or an ideal system which is yet to be developed, to annotate or keep certain types of credit where a person may not have time to read the article? Of course, we all understand the best way to judge an article is to read an article. But however, we also understand, we live in a world where the administrators and sometimes people who are responsible giving you grants and promotions may not be people in your field of research, so may not understand the science that you're doing. So some kind of metric associated with the quality of science probably is important. Do you think we should, or we are moving in that direction where a single number, not just a descriptive idea where people may not understand who are not in the field, is ideal? Or should we even think about that?
You want me to answer?
Yes,
I think that there is, as you point out, an inevitable push by people in the universe to turn everything, to try to distill the complexities of almost anything that we produce into a number, right? We want to rate restaurants by stars. We want movies to be 2 thumbs up or thumbs down, right? We want everything to be quantified, right? You watch what do you call football match these days, and every player's performance has to be turned into some player rating, right? We have a natural instinct to turn things into simple to absorb and also not particularly think about numbers. I think it's inevitable that will happen no matter what we do. I do think we should fight against it as much as possible, because I think that it's not so much that it's bad to try to distill information into easy to consume bits for people to absorb. It's just that every time we come up with something that we think captures some important aspect of people, their production, their value in a number, we make that number, and we use that number. We make that number the goal rather than the things that go into it. So you see that already in science. I mean, everybody likes to rip on impact factors. Impact factors are perfectly useful. I mean, they're not maybe all that meaningful, but I can understand why it's of interest to somebody to know how many times are the papers in a particular journal cited. That means something in the abstract. When that becomes the way that you evaluate a scientist's output, right, it it just becomes something you can game and manipulate and misunderstand and people misuse. And we get emails from journals reporting their impact factor to 6 significant digits, and like we should, I mean, it's not always possible to fight against that instinct, but I certainly don't think we should cater to it. I think we should make it difficult for people to overly metricize science, and we should try to figure out what are ways to provide people with the information that they want. I'm an expert, I read a paper, I want to tell people what I think about it in a way that is clear and digestible without being trivialized or metricized. And it's a hard problem. It's hard to convey information clearly and crisply in words all the time that everybody will absorb the same way. Numbers are easier, even as silly as they often are, to turn your judgment of a work into a number. It has a certain clarity to it, if not value. So I understand that people want that. I do think there's a lot of things that are happening around preprints that are pushing us in directions like that. But I think by and large, we should not give those. We should look at those as nuisances around the system of an ecosystem of information, not as something that's that we should value.
Thank you, Mike.
I really think.
Sorry, Katie, please go ahead.
I do really think that the problem that you started this with is a real one, which is that there are often people who need to make a judgment about a particular piece of work without either having the time or perhaps the expertise needed to be able to do a proper job of evaluating it themselves. And it's one of the things that makes a peer review system where preprints or other early publications are publicly reviewed by peers in a way that is not reduced to a number. It makes that system particularly attractive to me because it makes those evaluations available for others to see as well, and to have access to that expert information in a way that they don't in the traditional system. So when peer reviews are closed, we lose that value or the ability to actually see the more detailed qualitative judgment that people are providing of the work.
Right, absolutely. Now, let me come to you, Rahul. In India, as you know, the adoption of preprints is not just low, but most of the senior investigators are either completely unaware of preprints or don't have a favorable view of preprints. The old habits die hard process force most to think that the process of peer review is sacrosanct. Because I don't blame them. They grew up in a culture of being a graduate student, postdoc, and early career researchers, then mid-career researchers, then a professor in that process. So it's a very hard thing to let go. And the fact that the preprints are not peer-reviewed is so hardwired within them. Most senior investigators, at least, think negatively about preprints or just don't know about it. So I must tell our viewers that in getting a discussant from India for this very podcast, I had to actually struggle. Those I approached either politely declined or just had some excuse, which tells us that how difficult it is for people within the country to talk openly about preprints. Now, Rahul, why do you think the attitude of most senior researchers in India is so not positive about preprints? And do you think I was incorrect in saying so? I mean, although the number of preprints from India has gone up since the pandemic, there is no doubt about it. Still, the total number of preprints, if you take the total number of researchers into account, is abysmally low. I mean, we were actually one of the first labs in India, if I may say so, starting from 2011-12, started posting preprints, and I was criticized initially for doing so. But I knew that we were doing the right thing. So let me come back to you, Rahul. Tell us, what do you think the situation on the ground in India today, and why most senior investigators are not pushing for making preprints mandatory from their lab, at least, or their institutions?
Okay, thanks, Binay. So, in fact, I was kind of wondering what I'm doing here, and it turns out a lot of people turned you down. So, so I have been outspoken about open science, and I've even been on a couple of committees, but I have not edited any journals or chaired any organizations. So just a little bit about my history. I started my PhD in 1994, and that was in condensed matter physics. And Paul Junpark started the archive in 1991, I believe. So by the time I started my PhD, the archive was established in high energy physics and catching on in condensed matter and other areas of physics, especially theoretical physics. So at that time, experimental physicists still had a bit of resistance, but it was completely normal for theoretical condensed matter physicists and mandatory pretty much for high energy physicists to put their papers on archive first thing. So I would not say that 2011 is the starting point for preprint culture in India. It depends on the field, and that's what I want to specify, sort of emphasize that. Um, in really depends on the field. In physics, mathematics, computer science, many branches of engineering, preprint culture has been there since the 90s. In biology, it started much later. In chemistry, it started even later. In other fields, it's still not started. It's interesting to ask why not. So that's one point I want to make about field specificity, and the resistance that you talk about might come from that. One point of resistance that I see frequently is not about how can it not be peer reviewed, but more concerns about priority. And I see that especially even in younger scientists, they got a cool new result and they actually asked me, is it a good idea to put it on bioarchive? What if I get scooped? And I say, if you put it on bioarchive, you get a DOI and you can cite it. But it is true that many journals still don't accept citing bioarchive. So it is a legitimate concern, but I try to convince them that if it is there with your name on the internet, with a bioarchive does not delete old versions. If you revise it, your old version stays there. Similar with archive and other respectable things. So that is the misconception that I think I have personally faced most often. Now, with regard to peer review, this is definitely so. We have a paper that has been on medRxiv for about 2 years, and it does something that I personally think is cool and useful, which is the ability to predict the birth weight of a newborn with an accuracy of something like 8%. After it got published 2 weeks ago, suddenly there's a huge amount of interest, even though everything was there online already. So the reality is that people do see why. I mean, people do think that the sort of stamp of a formal academic journal does count. And as Mike was saying, I think we have to figure out how to improve the post preprint but pre-publication peer review system, so that you can convince people that a paper that has been on bioarchive or medRxiv or archive, whatever, has had enough peer input. After all, Perelman got the a Millennium Prize for a paper that is on archive and was never published. There is no reason to say it has to be published in a journal, but it has to be accepted by the community. So we need to evolve mechanisms, and recognizing that this meeting is probably primarily about biology, I think the biology community needs to figure out how to do this. So I had a couple other things to say that, preprints is one aspect, and I think they are very good. So I don't think I've ever met anyone except Binay in real life, but I have seen Mike at a conference. I think it was Recom RegGen in 2004 or some. It might have been something like that. And he had a T-shirt saying "Publish free or die," and I was thinking, what kind of slogan is that? I am not an American, and I later realized that's the New Hampshire motto, "Live free or die." And I was thinking, what kind of motto is that? But it is a very aggressive kind of stance that I have seen from the open access community since that time. So that was about the time I switched from physics to biology. And I was kind of taken in by the open access journals like PLOS and BMC and so on. And the fact that they charge hundreds or thousands of dollars to publish, at that time it was like 1,000 or 1,500, was a concern. But At that time,
So
they also
Rahul,
gave waivers to people from third world countries. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I want to
Yeah.
come back to the APC
Yes.
later. So if you
Absolutely.
hold
Yes.
on, because this is one of the
Yes.
big killer of sending to some journals. So I want to come back to that. So if you hold on to
Yes.
your
Yes.
thought,
Yes. Yes. I know you feel
I
about
want to
that, and I will stop
clarify.
at that.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
want to clarify when I said 2011 and 12, I meant specifically life sciences community. And you are absolutely right that the physics and the math community are way ahead. Always, in fact, the whole archive started with that. And in fact, even today, most of them don't even bother to send it to a journal for peer review. They think it's deposited in archive, read it, comment it, use it. So I think the biology community, and I can tell you from my personal experience of working in 4 different continents, biologists are the most conservative ones. They hold on to everything. And it's probably, I don't know why, but this is true. And I know from the US to Europe to Japan to India, the 4 geographies that I've worked, biologists tend to be way more conservative. But that's the fact. But the interesting thing is that the preprints are understood. Now some of the investigators understand preprint, but they somehow, as you mentioned, in your own case, when the preprint is there for 2 years, but nobody gives a damn about it until it's just all of a sudden gets a stamp of approval. And that is exactly what we need to fight. And I'm fighting almost every day in the committees that I represent. But I think old habits die hard. Our best approach could be just to work with the younger researchers and just completely forget.
I mean, look, I think it's really important to note that that system that we so cherish is really bad, right? Like it's like part of the reason why I've, I was always so like, believed that we needed to do things differently was not some abstract, principle based on the history of New Hampshire. It's based on the fact that it's actually better for science if we shed this system where we put, the system is bad in several different ways. And when we come back to the APC question, look, it's a huge regret of mine about the way that this all went, that we got embroiled in this open access publishing thing, which never really was the point, right? The point was 2 things needed to change in science. We needed everybody to be able to have access to the science, right? But the huge problem we faced when the internet came along was that people just used this business model from print era basically as an excuse to deny most people in the world access to information that was easy for them to now distribute, right, by the internet. And second, that the system, that the system that had evolved around pre-publication peer review and using journals as a way of encoding information about what is and isn't valuable and interesting is bad. It's not just it doesn't work well, right? Handing out jobs and awards and things like that based on where you publish is a miscarriage of science. It's giving, it isn't representing things well. We all know that papers easily get through, many of the papers that easily get through peer review and get published in high profile journals turn out to be wrong. And many of the most important things in science are not appreciated when they're initially published, and people think that they can't be right. I mean, every year when the Nobel Prizes come out, there's at least one story of somebody whose work couldn't be published because its value wasn't appreciated, right? I've gotten bored even looking, because it's always the case, right? That we have to recognize that the system that we use, where people get jobs and whatever the accolades in science and value in science based on where they publish their papers, is actually bad. It's not just an inefficient way of doing it. It's not that it carries external costs in terms of making papers inaccessible and so forth. It is bad in and of its own right. And the hope that I think a lot of us have around preprints is that they will break that system. They will make us get away from the whole concept of using journals as a way of encoding information and come up with something better. What that better isn't, I think, lots of ideas exist out there, and it's not clear what that's going to be and how we should do it. And I hope there's an ecosystem of different things that people try, and we never arrive at a single answer, because it's the fact that we have a single answer now that's that's part of the problem. So I really want to emphasize that point over and over again. We shouldn't try to figure out how to reconstruct that system around preprints. The peer review system we have today is bad. We need something better and fundamentally different that is trying to address the problems. And I just want to make a side point about something else, which is I understand why people in India are reluctant to embrace this system, right? It's because, right, one of the problems with preprints, if there is a problem with preprints for me, it's not so much that they're not peer reviewed as much as it encourages people to, to make judgments about a piece of science based on who the authors are, right? I think that, for better or for worse, and I think largely for worse, a system of high profile journals does afford you, if you can get your paper into one of those journals, it gives people something else to look at besides your name and your institution and things like that on which to judge the paper, right? We all know that where you are and what your name is help you get your papers into those journals. So the system is hardly an egalitarian one. But and science, even before you get to that point, the differences in funding and things like that are massive, massively skew who can even, get across the line in the first place. But I understand in a world where, a lot of people will just toss a paper out without even really paying attention to it if it's not from, not from the US or Europe, but not from a handful of institutions in the US and Europe. You're as likely to get your paper tossed in the bin if you're from the University of Kentucky as you are from India, I think. I mean, people are biased in so many bad ways in science. I understand why, if you're used to having your work not given not appreciated for its actual value in the current world, I think I understand why you would be reluctant to embrace a system that at the current moment at least makes it look like that's the going to play an even bigger role in what gets attention. So I do think there's that problem that we have to grapple with, which is we can't have a world where you just say, okay, post everything on preprints and people will read what they want, because what people want to read isn't what they should be reading, and like that is a problem we've never figured out how to address. The journals address it to some extent in some way, but it's not a perfect one.
Right. I must tell you that one of the reasons that I have heard from people, particularly those who do not trust preprints during the early COVID time, I don't know how many of you may know, there was one preprint from an established research institution in India that actually published the homology between the HIV-1 sequence and the COVID SARS-CoV-2. Now, of course, we knew that was a very badly designed study, and it was just basically very wrong piece of work. And I'm sure the investigators realized it and retracted it. Now, however, I keep telling that the papers published in Science and Nature also tend to be wrong. It's just a preprint being wrong cannot be held accountable to all the preprints. And that's just one of the reasons I wanted to tell. Now, Katie, I want to come back to you. Now, before your current role as the executive director of ASA Bio, you had a career in psychology at various capacities. First as an academic, and then as someone who was involved in community engagement. How do you, in your experience, describe the psychology community in terms of considering preprints in giving credit, faculty appointment, promotions, or anything else? Are they more proactive than the life sciences community? Are they less proactive? And if yes, what's the reason? And if not, why not?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, my experience as a faculty member was, so far from my conversations that I've had with people in the life sciences community, sounds very, very similar. I think the overall culture is that we didn't really have a preprint culture prior to recent years. SciArchive, the preprint server that I helped to manage and launch, launched in 2016, so a couple of years after bioRxiv, and its launch was sort of concurrent with other developments in the open science movement and in the community more broadly. So as that movement has grown and spread, preprints have also grown and spread, but there's still a lot of people that are not necessarily taking advantage of all the benefits that preprints have to offer. I will say, I think there's maybe somewhat less resistance for reasons that are specific to life sciences. So I've heard arguments about, prior to the pandemic, especially people would claim that there might be some extra risk in releasing papers that have a medical concerns or considerations. In psychology, in some areas of psychology, that's relevant, right? The clinical areas of psychology have some of the same concerns, but maybe less of those concerns are keeping people from engaging with the practice. But the same issues that you all have raised here about fears of being scooped, worries about quality, those sorts of things, those get in the way. I will say we've had some success with uptake, though. The growth is quite strong in adoption on the SciArchive preprint server. And one of the things that I think that has helped is we have these bots on social media. So we had them on Twitter, and now we have them on Blue Sky and elsewhere. And they just send out a notification of every new paper that's posted, so there's a few dozen a day or something like this. And so I think there's, already interesting ways that are increasing the exposure of the papers, and that's attractive to people, right? Having a new channel or a new way to disseminate their work is certainly attractive. But I'm definitely mindful of the issue that Mike was just talking about as well, about sort of the economy of attention, that it's not equal, and that it's a consideration of how we have to think about as a community for how to make sure that it's not just the biggest names and the most powerful people that get attention in this new economy.
Thank you, Katie. Now let me come to one of the most important and critical aspects to at least the young researchers, especially postdocs. If the postdocs publish preprints, will that be counted in the faculty appointments? And that is one of the most important questions that each postdoc who is applying for faculty positions actually is asking. Mike, can you tell our viewers how things are at US universities in general and in Cal in particular? I mean, are preprints considered as full publication in faculty appointments? If not, should they not be? And if they are, how are they being considered?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't speak for every place in the US, but in my experience, they are not just considered, but often featured these days in people's job applications. I think, the typical, it was always a challenge for postdocs applying for jobs that they're, almost always their most interesting and important work was their most recent work. And the situation we used to have was that people would, you have to plan to go on the job market. It's not a trivial thing to do. And people would be start the application process as their papers were going through peer review. And you would very often have this situation that you would be applying for a job based on work that was somewhere stuck in the peer review system. And so it was always true that we got a lot of manuscripts in job applications. And manuscripts have a little bit of they're great because they show you the work is at least complete in some level, right? It's not just vaporware that someone's talking about. There's a complete story there that you can evaluate. And yet, the authors haven't really stood behind it in the same way that they do if you post a preprint, right? And so as soon as preprints became a viable reality in science, actually the first place we started to really see it popping up was in job applications from postdocs. That the cost to postdocs for posting a preprint when they were applying for jobs was seen as very low, right? And the value was extremely high because now you had something tangible you could point to. Did every search committee consider it equally? No. does every person who sits on a search committee have their own attitudes about preprints and so forth? And of course, but as a general rule, I would say that of the faculty cases I've seen, and increasingly the grant applications and things like that, they almost all feature preprints. And in many cases, the key work that someone is sort of asking you to hire them on the basis of, and at least critical parts of it exist as preprints now. And so I think we've, as Rahul will probably know from computational fields, this was true in computational hires for as long as I can remember, right? People were, even in biology, people had preprints on arXiv and other places. So it's not like it's a completely new concept to evaluate faculty candidates based on this. But what has changed is, the absence of a preprint now. If you're applying for a job and you say, I've done this great work, if you don't have a preprint, I mean, if it's not published, obviously, if you don't have a preprint of it, people will now consider it to be speculative and not real, and are starting to really expect you to have a preprint if you're going to claim that something's true. So it's over the last decade that is, I'd say completely shifted, and it's a good example of where the kind of, sorry, we've dealt with New Hampshire. Now we're going to deal with baseball, just to make things particularly accurate, right? The cheesy Kevin Costner baseball movie Field of Dreams, right, which I do not like, and even though I'm a baseball fan, has that great line, right? You can build it, they will come. That happened with preprints, right? Like, Cold Spring Harbor put out bioRxiv. It just existed. There was no like external force telling people you had to post things in bioRxiv. It wasn't like a mandate. People weren't being paid to do it. The rewards were not explicitly laid out for anybody. And yet people started to realize, oh, here's a situation where I'm going to benefit directly from taking advantage of bioRxiv. And I think one of the main reasons it has grown as it has been because of job applicants. It's the kind of pressure point where getting your work out there, getting it visible is the most acute, and where the problems of the increasing delays in publishing became more and more problematic. This relieved a huge pressure valve, at least in the U.S. system. And I think part of the reason that worked was we are less. It's not like we don't consider Nature papers and Cell papers in our hiring. It's just we tend not to be quite as rigid about it as and formulaic about it as there are in lots of places in Europe and across the world. And so there was an opening that people could slip into that I think may or may not exist in other places. So whether that's transportable, I think is more a question of individual places.
Yeah, I would also say this matches my experience as well.
Go on.
Sorry.
Sorry, go on.
This matches my experience very well at serving on hiring committees, and I think one of the things I didn't know from the outside before I served on hiring committees is that the universities receive a lot of applicants for these positions. Heuristics are definitely used to determine which candidates, get attention and end up, say, on a short list. However, to give the folks that, serve on these committees some credit, once you're down to that narrow list, the short list, whatever it is, 20 or 10 people or something like that, those candidates get, a lot of detailed scrutiny, including for things like the content of the most recent paper that you've posted or that you've shared. And so if it's a publication, fine, but a preprint is even better because it shows what you're currently working on, and it shows that, sort of the momentum of the direction you're heading in.
Thank you. And I think that's very heartening to what both of you have said, that the appointment committees do take into consideration a preprint. That is, as Mike said, is actually almost negative if you haven't posted something in preprint and you're boasting that you have done some good work. And now coming to Rahul, this is antithesis of what we do in India. Now, as you know, that we have very stringent rules, at least in the university system. In an institute system, I know it's very much dependent on the guy who's sitting on the top. But in the university system, we are very much governed by what the University Grants Commission the body which is sitting on all the top of the universities tell us how we should scrutinize the candidates. Now, Rahul, in your institute, in the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, do you take preprints into consideration during faculty appointments and promotions? And you may not be directly involved, but are you aware that they are taken? And if not, is there any initiative to at least talk about it? Sorry, you are muted.
Yes, sorry. So in my institution, we are, as you are aware, a very small institution, and we are further divided into 4 groups, and we are the smallest group of all, computational biology. Faculty hirings are discussed extensively within the specific group and only then taken upstream. And at that level, absolutely preprints are considered. As I mentioned, physics, maths, computer science, these are the 3 other groups, have been into preprint culture since the 1990s. And we in computational biology basically come from that background, and we also take preprints seriously. So that's absolutely not an issue for us. And when it comes to the selection committee, they look at the CVs and they also look at our inputs. So, and I have been on a couple of committees as an internal member. I don't think for us that is an issue, but we are not really representative in that sense of the broader Indian picture. Where I will say it has been an issue, we are not a university. We are part of a kind of umbrella university which encompasses many other institutions. And that umbrella university for PhD students requires certain publication requirements. And for life sciences in particular, they require a first author paper published or accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. And that has come up as an issue a couple of times, including with my students, and we have argued it out. But that particular attitude is hard to change, even though many other top Indian institutions do not have such a requirement. So I agree with you, Binay, completely that there are many old school people in the Indian system who simply do not buy preprints. But having said all that, I do see some issues with preprints. I mean, I fully agree with Mike and Katie that for a postdoc who's applying for a faculty position, or even for a PhD student who's applying for a postdoc position, a preprint sort of puts it out there that this is what I've done, and I'm willing to stand by my name on it in a public archive server. It is not some nonsense that will discredit me down the line. It could be improved, but as it is good enough for me to put my name there. I think that's how preprints should be viewed. And in terms of attitudes, again, I think it is very field specific, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it that physics, maths, various engineering disciplines have accepted this since the 90s, and biology is kind of resistant, other sciences are extremely resistant up until this date. And I think some of it is the question of incentives, like is there in physics, for example, Physical Review Letters is the topmost journal, but it's not like if you're never published there, you're not going to have a career. It's fine if you're published in other physics journals. Whereas in biology, the CNS system has kind of become some kind of unattainable ideal for many people. And then there's a question of persuasion. If as a community, people need to be persuaded to use preprints. Why was the physics community persuaded so quickly, so fast, while it has taken so long for the biology community with many holdouts? I think we need to ask ourselves that question too. And lecturing may not be the answer. Instead, we have to think about how we can show the benefits, and also how we can honestly discuss the shortcomings and improve them. Because there is a problem with, again, returning to APC-based journals, that they have encouraged a system of spammy journals that take money and publish papers, and that has been a problem in India particularly. But I've also seen cases with preprints where people, young students, postdocs, and even faculty in maybe less prestigious institutes, so to speak, just put huge amounts of preprints there. And if you're going to just count preprints, you have to be willing to read them and evaluate them. And if it's obvious nonsense, you can make that out. But when it's borderline, no selection committee has the bandwidth to read every candidate's paper from start to end. So the peer review system does play a role in that sense of some kind of gatekeeping. And if we are going to say that journals are not playing that role, then we have to show what else can play that role instead of asking everybody to read everything on bioarchive, which is never going to work.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, this is a very interesting point that you mentioned, that the current peer-reviewed journals do have a role. And I think I partially know the answer, although I don't know the fully answer, that why biology community is more resistant. I think one of the reasons is just sheer numbers. In fact, there was one paper published. If you compare the number of grad students in the physics and mathematics, biology far exceeds those two communities. So for a single faculty appointment or for a single postdoc, you have a lot more applicants from biology than you would probably in a solid state physics department, or a string theorist nowadays probably are just living fossils. There are not many people doing PhDs there. So I think when you have sheer numbers of people to evaluate, the peer-reviewed journals and the journal impact factor is just an easy surrogate to use. That's probably one of the reasons. It's a lame reason.
But I will say, I honestly don't think that is. I'm not going to say this doesn't play a role, but I think people have, in my experience, vastly overstated the impact that journals play in even hiring, even in like elite institutions where most of the faculty hired have Science, Nature, Cell papers, right? Like the process of picking finalists for faculty jobs is not ever, in my experience, a process of scanning a list for papers. The primary thing people look at is, do I find what you're working on interesting? Do I find what you're working on important? Those things also happen to be the same characteristics that the journals are looking for. So there is an induced correlation between these two things. And one thing I've started to look at, and I think that it's an interesting analysis that I haven't seen done formally, and it's sort of something I've been working on, is if you look at people who are hired without their papers being published yet at these institutions, where do they get published, right? Like this idea that you need to have a Nature paper in order to get hired at a place is often belied by the fact that the papers that these Nature papers that people are talking about aren't published yet when they're hired for these jobs. So they are hired on the basis of a Nature paper, but the paper hasn't been accepted at Nature when they're hired. And so the preprints have keep giving us this opportunity actually to start to look at these questions. And I think that people often misconstrue the centrality of this process. Now, is it better? Is it good that it's very hard to get through the door at a top institution if you don't come from another of one of 10 top institutions? No, that's terrible. Is it good that we try to hire people? I think if you don't have AI in your job application these days, you're probably not getting a job anywhere, right? Like people are trendy. They follow fads in science in their hiring. They tend to be drawn to people who come from the labs of people that they know and institutions that they put in the top echelon. The system is skewed and biased and ineffective, but I don't think that what actually happens ever is people scan the list for Science and Nature papers. They scan the list for people who are doing something that they find interesting. And often you don't even get to them to read beyond the first couple of sentences of your job description if of their application, if what they're working on isn't exciting to you, right? My students, I think, are suffering from a thing like this recently, in that it's not trendy to work on model systems anymore, right? Everybody wants people to work on stem cells and biology, right? And so if you just say, I work on Drosophila, okay, right? So it's so I think that we've for too long let ourselves get trapped in the system of journals that work in a way that is clearly suboptimal, because we have let ourselves be convinced, or we have convinced ourselves that we can't operate, that the whole system breaks down if we don't have these journals, when I think, in fact, it's not even, they are not used in the way that we attribute them. And again, it's not true everywhere, but it's certainly the case that our hiring is heavily enriched for people who are published in these journals. But it doesn't follow that the journals are the thing that's getting people hired. I mean, I think it's a representation of the fact that the system is very highly correlated, and publishing in those journals is correlated with funding, is correlated with being at the top institutions in these preeminent labs. And so it all, you can use any of those factors to pick the candidates. You don't have to use journal titles, and you'll end up with people who are publishing in those journals. So
this is
can I just say that I really admire Mike Eisen for standing up to his principles and not publishing in Cell Nature Science, and his students nevertheless do well. And this is something the rest of us should.
Well, before Katie, actually, you say I have to critique Mike on this, and he's the first one to agree with me on this. Not everybody is Mike Eisen, who has a very illustrious career. He comes from Stanford. He was before that in very good institutes and very good PIs. If you are in a lesser known institutions and haven't published in Nature Cell Science, is a biologist, send your application. Most likely they are going to be read with contempt.
No, but here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. So there's I do agree with the things that Mike is saying, but there's this one little piece of psychology that's very interesting, and I think actually it goes against maybe what Binay was just saying as well. So the interesting bit of psychology is that in not just in the area of publishing and academic norms and so on, but in all human norms, people, look to others to see what is normal and see sort of what is accepted in their community. However, we are not terrifically good judges of what those norms are. Like, people are often inaccurate. And so in this particular instance, the situation is that if you ask individual scientists, what are your own values? What do you believe? And so on, they often say something that sounds like what Mike said. I pay attention to what's interesting to me. I look at the quality of the work and so on. But if you ask them what they think their peers think, they think, oh, all my peers value these journals and so on. And so, it's this slightly a little bit of a need to think well of ourselves, right? That we have a higher moral standing than others, but it's also just that we're really bad at assessing what other people think. And so I think in this situation, it's actually really important to speak against those norms publicly, because it helps to foster a culture in which we're better aligned actually in our expectations of what our peers want.
By speaking directly to this, Katie, when I was hired at Berkeley, shortly after that, I was this is when we were starting PLOS and really starting to kind of agitate against the publishing system. I had several, not just one, members of my own faculty, my colleagues here, tell me that you cannot get a job at Berkeley without a Science, Nature, Cell paper. These people had gotten jobs at Berkeley without a Science, Nature, Cell paper, and yet they were so convinced of that the system works in a way that their own experience is just was not relevant, and they would say things that were just false. They knew were false, and I don't know whether they convinced themselves that they'd had Science, Nature, Cell papers before they were hired or what, but we believe this to be true to an extent that is just irrational, because it is not empirically true that it is the only and most important thing. I do think there's another aspect of it that I think plays into this, which is, by the time you're publishing a paper, right, what you work on, what field you're in, what institution you're at, who you work for, what results you have, those are all baked in, right? You can't go back in time and change your results. Well, I mean, if you do that, people sometimes do that, but you can't go back in time and change what institution you work at or what field you're in or those choices. But the only lever you still have in your control is what journal you publish your paper in. And I think that gives people an outsized sense of how important it is, because at that point in time, it's 100% of the remaining sort of variance explained is in the journal, and people discount all the other stuff that plays into it because it's no longer a variable. This like as the end of the publishing process, it feels much more important than it is, because it does contain like a huge amount of the remaining variance in the outcomes, but not a substantial fraction of the total variance, which I think is something that gets a little bit lost in most people's psychology of it.
Absolutely. So, Rahul, let me ask you the question that you posed just a little while back, that we being overly critical doesn't help, but we have to find some solutions. Now, as you know, being the two largest funders, Department of Biotechnology and Department of Science and Technology in the Indian government, the two largest funder of the extramural grants, despite having guidelines and policies that we should not consider the journal impact factor in selection of grants, fellowships, appointment, every single JAM application have one column saying that what's the journal impact factor, what's your H index, and every single time I write that, just refer back to your own policy, which says that you don't have to give it, and they reject the application. Now, the question to you is, what can we do to work with these bodies? And people who have worked with this right to the top. I mean, the thing is that we sometimes get to this wall, that what can we do as a community, a research community, to change the practice that they themselves have told not to use, but they continuously use it even to today?
So I remember Vijay Raghavan, the former principal scientific advisor, and before that, former DPT secretary, and so on, saying that they is us. And I mean, it's not some external system. We have to be part of that system. But how do we? I mean, he's now basically retired, but he was for many years in these positions, and he had some impact, but most of us will think that the system is much as it was before. How to change the system in these respects, especially in such a large country as India? Um, I really don't know. I don't think I have an answer to that. So, going back to the umbrella university that we have, I'm part of the Life Science Board of Studies and I'm one voice there. But on certain aspects, many of them agree with me, but it is short down upstream. On certain aspects, I'm in a minority, and I agree also that on certain aspects they have a point. I'm not talking specifically about open access or preprints, but um, there are many voices in India, and again, I would say if we believe that preprints are a legitimate form of scientific communication that can be treated on a par with peer-reviewed journals, we have to make the case. And the physicists have successfully made the case for 30 years now. How do this, not just in India, how does the biology community globally make that case? And in India, how do we make the case to younger people? I think that's important. But I don't really have an answer.
Thank you. And Katie, that brings to the next question for you. Now you are in ASA Bio. Do you think ASA Bio has been successful in its efforts to do what it intended to do and still intends to do? And what is the organization doing to promote open science, preprint being a part of it, and bring more diversity of thought, more women, people who were from global south, from different geography, because the efforts towards making open science available and science openly available to all is irrespective of where one works. So do you think that ASA Bio has been successful? And if not, then what exactly ASA Bio doing in the coming years to make it even more successful?
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, I think we have definitely been successful so far. The organization has already been around the last 7 or 8 years, and in concert with the growth of preprints in the life science community. So I'd like to think that the organization had something to do with that. I just joined in June of last year, so I can't really claim any credit for any of that that work. But my predecessor, Jessica Polka, and Johnny and his predecessors, have done a lot of work to facilitate the growth in preprints, and a large part of that work has been in facilitating work directly with the community. So providing training, information, role models. We have a very successful fellows program that has brought a lot of people up in thinking about how they want to communicate the results of their research. Where we're going next is we're thinking more about how we can better support those early career researchers that we've been supporting all along. And this conversation around recognition and rewards for these activities is coming front and center. So we're thinking about how we can help people who are a bit later in their career, but really convinced of the importance scientifically of changing publishing practices. And we believe that by creating structures that enable institutions, universities, and so on to create reward structures and policies that better support these activities, that we will help them continue to grow. So that's where our focus is going to be in the coming year.
I think Katie's being too modest on behalf of ASAP Bio. I think that at the beginning of the preprint moment in biology, in particular, ASAP Bio it's really just essential in normalizing the idea of publishing preprints and giving it visibility, and just this thing you talk about scientists being conservative. You can take advantage of that sometimes by taking something and kind of just honestly, they synthesized this idea that preprints were going to be a normal thing to do in biology, and they just made it true by not treating all of the reluctance and nerves people have. They didn't ignore it, but they didn't treat it as a fundamental obstacle. They treated it as something that could be overcome by just sort of recognizing the advantages of preprints. And I think that they were, who knows what happens without any organization in the universe, but from my position on the ground, as having been wanting something like this to happen for such a long time, once bioRxiv was created, ASAP Bio played just an absolutely essential part in making this happen. I think there's something to be learned in other places about just the. Obviously ASAP Bio was very US, to some extent Europe focused, but to getting that the obstacle that you can overcome of just normalizing things in some way is really, really, really important.
Absolutely. And thank you, Mike, for saying that aloud. I think ASAP Bio has been phenomenal. I mean, absolutely phenomenal. And the right word you used is normalizing preprints. And I think, I've been telling Johnny and Katie that it's time that ASAP Bio actually spreads the wing in different parts of the world. And there is no reason for us to reinvent the wheel, because the best practices is already there. All we need to do is to just follow the lead and do the same thing. And I can tell you personally, in my lab, we're trying to do that, although way less successfully than anyone there, but at least we're trying. And I think that's what we need to continue to do. So the next question I have is, again, another topic which is very near and dear to all, which is APC. One of the reasons that we tend to not send to certain journals, even if we love the journals, is there is a huge article processing fee, which is beyond any of us, at least in the global south. I can tell you that some nature journals have APC, which is 50% of one of my grants. So you can imagine that is beyond most of the researchers to pay for the article processing fee. Now, of course, we do have a choice to send it to a society journals, but many society journals don't accept preprints. And that is a showstopper for many of the researchers to be in between the rock and the hard place because they want to send it to preprint, but at the same time, the journals are prohibitively expensive. So what should a researcher do where the APC is high and a person wants to send this to a journal? What is the way out? And of course, there are waivers, but I can tell you my personal experience. I know PLOS was really great, but lately, they're good, but they keep sending you the reminders to pay the APCs, despite the fact that I have told that I can't pay the APC and I have been agreed right in the beginning that I don't have money to pay the APC. And they said the system is made in such a way they cannot not send the email. So the email I get every week, pay the APC. I say, well, I can't. So Mike, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Rahul and then Katie on this. What's the best way out for this APC? Because I personally think, and I think I've told this to you before in my earlier podcast with you, Mike, there is no way that a person can pay $2,000 to $3,000, which I understand getting things done in the US and Europe are expensive because you need people to do screening, you need people to chase the reviewers, that costs money. But the $2,000 to $3,000, which is the bare minimum, it appears the cost for a single article to be published is way too high for most of humanity. What's the way out?
Well, sure. I mean, I think there's two questions there. There's what's the way out as an individual researcher is one thing, but the question of what's the way out for us as a society, I think is the bigger thing. I mean, right, APCs, having been partially responsible for propagating them, right? Like our concept at the beginning was, we spend a lot of money on publishing. And that money ultimately comes from one big pot. I mean, obviously it's little, there's different sources, but it's coming from, science, right? Like science is spending, $10 billion or roughly on publishing globally. And we do it in a really bad way, right? The system of publishing is set up so that people, basically, if you have subscriptions, you have to deny people access. It's an unfair system, so forth. The idea behind APCs initially was to bridge the gap, to come up with a way that didn't require paywalls, but which would help people realize that actually the right way to do this is not to have a transactional system around publishing at all, right? The people who are benefiting from peer review and everything we want to add on and publishing and everything is science writ large. It's not the individual authors. To turn publishing into a business where either you as a reader or you as an author are bearing the cost of either consuming or publishing science is to ignore the fact that this is a collective endeavor and that the real value is to the collective, not to the individual, either as a reader, right? I want everybody to read as much science as they have because that's how science gets done. I want everybody to publish everything that they produce because that's how science gets done. There is no sane system that doesn't involve centralizing the costs and removing transaction costs from individuals. We have to get to that thing. And my biggest regret in publishing was that we didn't push for that from the very, very beginning, that we were sort of forced by reality into having a business model for what we were doing when what we should have said from the beginning was the only business model is the business model that helps science. And the business model that helps science is to subsidize all of these costs up front. It should not be a concern to you as an author that that you have to pay anything. You shouldn't have to pay a dime, let alone $2,000. We've created a world where we replaced barriers to reading papers to barriers to publishing papers, and that is no better, and maybe even worse. And so I think we have to just tackle this head on and say that moving forward, we need to put the costs on funders. And I think there's lots of ways you could imagine doing this in a fair and reasonably equitable way, but critically, the costs should not be anywhere near what they are now, right? Like operating a platform that could publish every paper in a, in a pretty and reliable way, bioarchives on a little bit of steroids or whatever you want to say. Those costs would be a fraction of what we're currently paying for publishing. The actual costs of peer review should be much lower than they are, right? Because the work is being done for free, right?
Exactly.
Yes, it's important to have people make sure the system works, but it's very hard to accept that would cost $10 billion a year to manage if done in a sane way. I think part of the problem is we have somewhere between 50 and 100,000 journals. That's a 50,000-fold redundancy in many ways, right? And so we are really inefficient in how we approach this, how we approach the cost. It's not going to be free. We want the system to work well. We want it to be efficient. We want people to have ways of addressing problems. We want people to make sure that there's not spam and harassment involved in the system. Those things are not free to do, but I think we spend just an inordinate amount of money on overseeing a system that doesn't do any of those things particularly well. And so I obviously the world's complicated. It's going to be inefficient in some ways, but I think we just have to say APCs are bad, subscription fees are bad. We shouldn't tolerate any of them. And if the funders insist on channeling their money through these systems in stupid ways and transactional ways, they're going to get a bad system that's an unfair one. And I think the funders of the world, I think, appreciate that, and we just have to figure out how to get them to kind of collectively see that's just not going to work.
Thank you. Rahul, how do we deal with this in India? This is a bigger problem for us. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So, Vinay, you mentioned your issues with reminders with flaws about APCs. Now, just to start, when I was just starting out here, I didn't have grants either, and I got a waiver from BMC Bioinformatics and I think one or two other journals. More recently, I do have grants, and but I have been a middle author on papers where the senior author was refused and waiver. So it used to be that these journals will promise that you will pay according to your capacity, and that's absolutely not true. They say India is a middle income country, and therefore they will not take account of individual circumstances. So I'm in a fortunate situation, so I could pay for it. Otherwise, I think it would not have been published. So going on to the costs of publishing, I have a basic question that I could ask to both Mike and Katie, maybe, that, bioarchive is free, archive is free, and that's because they are subsidized. Now, what is the value addition by the journals on top of this? I mean, the cost of putting out a paper that can be served to scientists around the world must be big, and that's basically IT infrastructure. On top of that, you're talking about peer review and copy editing. Supposing you forget copy editing, as CS and math people don't care about that. They publish the LaTeX author preprint as is. Why are we adding on extra costs to publishing? Why can't we make a free journal on the lines of bioarchive, but with peer review, which is free from the reviewer's point of view, added on top of it? What's the difficulty
so Rahul,
there?
you have started 2-hour discussion for Mike, so I think I'll have Mike to say that succinctly.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
So I think there's no reason we can't do it. I think that you're right. The costs are IT and staff, and a lot of what the staff are doing is dealing with bad IT. And I think that we have convinced ourselves that things need to work in a very particular way within publishing, and most of the costs involve kind of adhering to that style, right? Like, yes, copy editing. I don't think most readers really care deeply about whether or not papers are copy edited, right? And I think that if anything, we're heading to a world where that's going to get automated anyway. And I think that the hierarchy of journals, where we have 3 tiers of editors who are making decisions about what does and doesn't get peer reviewed, and it's just it doesn't. I don't think it helps in nearly the same way that we think, honestly, most of the cost ultimately boils down to customer service in the sense that, you as an author want your paper to be peer reviewed in some, period of time and, certain number of peer reviewers, and you want to be able to complain and get some kind of feedback. I appreciate that that's something people value, but we may have to let go of some of those demands because if you're forcing people to actually pay for those services, right? If you had an alternative where you could get your paper peer reviewed cheaply, you might not be able to complain. You might not have the same timing, but if your paper's already out there as a preprint, maybe you don't care as much. I've always joked, and I still hold by this. It costs us $10 billion a year. If someone came up to me with the deal and said, I'll give you $1 billion a year to publish and peer review everything in science, I'm pretty sure I could handle it and retire rich within a year. And so
Exactly.
I think that we've accepted this grossly inefficient, wasteful, both economically and time-wise system, and without really considering that it's in many ways unnecessary. So that's
Katie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a lot I could say about this topic. On the topic of cost, one thing to note is that although the preprint services and other open services are producing things that are free to read, they're certainly not free to run. So although they are much less expensive than the big publishers, it is an ongoing challenge for many of these services to remain sustainable and so on. And so that's something that the community has to grapple with overall. We just came out with this explainer piece this last week about the publish, review, curate model, which is kind of what we've been talking around in this call. And one potential application of a publish, review, curate model is that you can kind of skip the traditional process of publishing with a journal. So by the publishing in the publish, review, curate is the preprinting, right? So really, when we preprint a paper, we're making a claim public. So publishing happens, review can happen in the decentralized ways that Mike was talking about before. And then optionally, there can be a curation step where articles are gathered by topics, evaluated, and so on. And there's some filtration or sorting or something going on. So the model is already there. It exists. It's a matter of whether or not scholars opt into it, right? Whether or not researchers are ready to take up the model more. It's something we'd certainly like to see more of at ASAP Bio, and we've been thinking about ways to support the model and help it grow.
Thank you. And this is my final question. It has to be for Mike. So this is $1 billion question. Mike, you have been fighting for open dissemination of scientific information since your postdoc days at Pat Brown's lab in Stanford, and then with your association with Harold Varmus during the early days of eBiomed, and then with PLOS, and then with eLife, and so on and so forth. And in fact, if I may say, apart from the New Hampshire t-shirt, we also remember your affinity, as you mentioned, with the Red Sox and so many things. So you have been a maverick, and we appreciate what you have been doing, not just for you, for the community, for science, and is really praiseworthy. Now, the question is, are you frustrated that although we have made progress, no doubt about it, but very little progress? And are you hopeful that things will change for the better in the near future? What can we immediately do to make science more open and inclusive, or is it even worth thinking about it?
I mean, I live as a superposition of hopeful and hopeless about this. I mean, I am frustrated. I can't believe we're still talking about this stuff a quarter century after the internet came along and we started, sort of trying to realize the opportunity before us and using the internet to make publishing better, right? We are, fighting a lot of challenges, right? Like there's some high level conceptual ones. You have the problem of individual actors trying to navigate their own best interests in the face of a system that where the system would be better off if everybody did one thing, but you require individuals to make choices to do that, and it doesn't always happen that way. I think there's a deeper frustration with the fact that so many people in influential positions in science, actively fight these kind of changes. I won't even say that they're apathetic. They are, they are opposed to trying to make things more fair because they have benefited from a system that is unfair, and they don't want to change it. The forces of status quo and stability and stasis in the face of obvious evidence that these things are bad for science are really, really, really strong. The conservatism isn't just kind of philosophical conservatism, it's self-interested conservatism on the part of a lot of people in science. So I think that the fact that we have had very, very few sustained pushes from anybody in, real positions of power and positions to change anything, either with funders or academics or in government, it's huge disappointment, right? Like it's it's a missed opportunity, and I can't say I'm optimistic that that's gonna change. On the other hand, I think facts on the ground change all the time, and I think people are these systems, I think, are probably destined to collapse under their own weight of economic and functional, like just challenges. So I despair about our our ability to do the right thing here and approach the system and to change in a rational, design, deliberate way in which people do the right thing because it's the right thing. But I'm optimistic that the system will just collapse, and that once it collapses, that sanity will emerge from the ashes, I guess, is where my optimism lies now.
Thank you, Mike. I hear you. And that's all we have time for today. I want to thank Mike, Rahul, and Katie for being generous with their time in discussing various aspects of preprints and how we can promote preprints towards making science more open. I hope everyone who is watching or listening this podcast will consider posting preprints for all their research output and promoting it within their own institution. Thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thanks for having us, and thanks. It's great talking to everybody and seeing you.